The rumble of the old engine was a dull thrum against Dean's ribs, a constant vibration that had become the only steady rhythm in his life. He watched the highway unspool beneath the tires, a gray ribbon leading him further from everything he knew, everything he'd lost. The rearview mirror offered only a receding blur of trees and sky, a past he was determined to outrun. His grief, a cold, heavy stone, settled deeper in his chest with every mile. Yet there was a faint flicker of resolve, a desperate need for absolute quiet. He was a cartographer, accustomed to mapping the known, but now he was charting his own retreat into the unknown, a journey guided by a single fated deed. Hours bled into one another, the landscape shifting from rolling hills to flat, marshy plains. The air grew thicker, tasting of salt and damp earth. Finally, the road narrowed, twisting through stunted pines, until a ramshackle building, barely more than a weathered shack, appeared in the distance. This was it, the border checkpoint. He pulled his vehicle to a stop behind a single battered pickup truck, its bed piled high with fishing nets. The air was still, oppressive, carrying the distant, mournful cry of a seabird. A uniformed officer, his face tanned and creased like old leather, emerged from the shack. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his gaze sweeping over Dean's vehicle, then Dean himself, with an unnerving thoroughness. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a weary assessment. "Blackstone Isle," Dean replied, his voice a little hoarser than he'd intended. He handed over his identification and the creased, yellowed inheritance papers. The officer's eyebrows lifted fractionally at the mention of the island, a subtle shift that Dean didn't miss. It wasn't surprise, more like a confirmation of something already known, something unwelcoming. The officer scrutinized the documents, his thumb tracing the embossed seal. "Your grandfather's place," he murmured, more to himself than Dean. He handed the papers back, his movements economical. "The ferry's in an hour. Don't be late, it doesn't wait." There was no farewell, no pleasantry, just a dismissive nod toward the narrow track that led down to the water. The interaction left Dean feeling exposed, as if the officer had seen right through his carefully constructed facade of composure. The ferry was less a vessel, more a floating platform, its metal deck stained with rust and brine. A single hulking figure, the ferryman, stood at the helm, his back to the shore. He wore a heavy, oil-stained coat, his silhouette thick against the swirling grayness of the sky. Dean drove his vehicle onto the deck, the ramp groaning in protest. The ferryman didn't speak, didn't even turn. He simply untied the thick ropes with practiced ease, his movements slow but powerful. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through Dean's bones, and the platform began to churn through the choppy water. The fog rolled in then, not a gentle mist, but a thick, hungry curtain that swallowed the mainland whole. He could taste the sea on his lips, a bitter, wild tang. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a sensation he had craved, yet now found himself unsettled by its sheer magnitude. It rose from the water like a jagged tooth, its cliffs scarred and wind-blasted. The island was a study in desolation, its sparse vegetation clinging stubbornly to the rock. He could just make out the skeletal finger of the lighthouse, a stark silhouette against the perpetual gloom. The ferry bumped against a rudimentary dock, a collection of rotting timbers barely held together by rusted bolts. The ferryman, still silent, gestured with a tilt of his head towards a narrow, overgrown track. Dean drove off the ferry, the wheels crunching on loose gravel, leaving the ferryman and his vessel to melt back into the fog. The track was barely passable, choked with thorny bushes and slick with recent rain. The air here was different, heavier, carrying the scent of decay mixed with salt. He drove slowly, the vehicle groaning as it navigated potholes and exposed roots. The trees, gnarled and ancient, leaned inward, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for him. Finally, the track opened onto a small, wind-battered clearing. And there it was, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It stood hunched against the elements, a gray, sagging structure of weathered stone and peeling paint, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning sea. Dean killed the engine. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The cottage exuded an aura of profound neglect, its roof tiles missing in patches, its porch railing splintered. He walked towards the front door, a heavy, salt-pitted slab of oak. He put his hand on the door handle. It was encrusted with rust, rough beneath his fingers. As he pushed, a low, drawn-out groan echoed from within, as if the house itself was sighing, or perhaps protesting his arrival. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew, damp stone, and something else. Something ancient and subtly fishy, yet not quite fish. It was a smell that pricked at the back of his throat, a scent of the deep, of things long submerged. He tried to dismiss it, blaming the sea air, the age of the structure. He stepped inside, his boots scuffing on the gritty floorboards. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak light that penetrated a grimy window pane. He moved through the cramped living space, his hand trailing along a mantelpiece thick with grime. Every surface was coated, every object shrouded in a fine gray powder. As he stood in the main room, trying to take in the desolate grandeur, a flicker caught his eye. He whipped his head around, his breath catching in his throat. Nothing. He told himself it was fatigue, a trick of the light, the strain of the long journey. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. This island, this cottage, it was exactly what he had sought. Remote, desolate. A place where he could be utterly alone. The rearview mirror offered only the shrinking, indistinct shape of his past. Hours later, the landscape shifted. The asphalt gave way to a rough gravel path, and the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. A low, persistent fog began to creep in, tendrils reaching across the road like skeletal fingers. Ahead, barely visible through the swirling mist, stood a small utilitarian structure, the border checkpoint. He eased the truck to a stop before a raised boom barrier. A uniformed officer emerged from the booth, a figure wrapped in a heavy, oil-stained coat that seemed to absorb the meager light. The officer's face was etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. His eyes flat and gray like the sea on a winter morning. "Destination?" the officer asked. A silent appraisal that felt less like a security check and more like a premonition. Dean felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that had become a constant companion since he'd made the decision to leave. "Been a long time since anyone went out there," the officer mumbled, his eyes scanning the horizon where the island lay hidden, especially this time of year. "Tides are unpredictable." He gestured vaguely towards the unseen sea. "Take care out there. The sea gives and the sea takes." The words, simple as they were, settled in Dean's stomach like cold stones. Dean nodded, offered a tight-lipped thanks, and drove through, the checkpoint fading into the fog behind him almost immediately, as if it had never truly existed. The final stretch was a winding track, barely wide enough for the truck, that ended abruptly at a small, dilapidated pier. The air here was colder, heavier, saturated with the briny tang of seaweed and something else, something ancient and damp, like the inside of a forgotten cave. The cottage stood on a rise, a solitary sentinel against the endless gray expanse of the ocean, its whitewashed walls stained by decades of sea spray and neglect. Stepping out of the truck, Dean felt the wind whip around him, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was like a low hum, or perhaps a sigh, that seemed to resonate just beneath the threshold of hearing. He dismissed it as the wind whistling through the cottage's eaves, a common sound in such exposed places. He was tired, he told himself, and his grief was making him interpret every shadow, every sound, as something more. Moonlight, diffused by the persistent fog, spilled through grimy windows, painting the sparse furniture in muted silver. He spent the next few hours in a methodical, almost desperate attempt to impose order. He unpacked boxes, wiped down surfaces, and tried to coax a reluctant fire to life in the stone hearth. It was an exercise in distraction, a way to anchor himself in the tangible world. As dusk deepened, Dean noticed the tide. It was receding, but not in the steady, rhythmic pulse he expected. Instead, the water seemed to pull back in erratic surges, exposing more of the rocky shoreline than he thought possible, then creeping forward again in slow, hesitant waves. It was as if the sea itself was breathing unevenly, a vast, restless beast. He watched it for a long time, a knot tightening in his stomach, before rationalizing it as a peculiar effect of the island's unique currents. This was a remote place after all, and he was no expert on coastal hydrodynamics. At first, he thought it was the wind, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to coil around the cottage. But as the night wore on, and the fog pressed closer against the windows, it seemed to coalesce into something more defined, a sound that wasn't quite language, but carried the implication of it. It was a chorus of low, resonant tones, like distant whale song mixed with the creak of old wood, rising and falling with an unnatural rhythm. While attempting to clear out a cluttered desk in the study, a room his grandfather had apparently used for all manner of obscure research, his hand brushed against something heavy and bound beneath a stack of nautical charts. It was a journal, its leather cover warped and discolored, smelling faintly of brine and decay. It was clearly his grandfather's, the familiar spidery script on the first page confirming it. He opened it carefully. The pages within were thick and brittle, many of them water-damaged, the ink bleeding in places like old wounds. Most were filled with dense, almost frantic handwriting, but interspersed were disturbing sketches. They weren't of ships or lighthouses, but of abstract swirling patterns that seemed to mimic oceanic currents, or perhaps something far more sinister. There were distorted, elongated figures, barely human, with blank, unseeing eyes and limbs that seemed to ripple like kelp. His eyes snagged on a recurring phrase, scrawled repeatedly in the margins, sometimes underlined with furious strokes, sometimes barely legible through the water stains. The deep song. It appeared again and again, like a refrain, almost an obsession. His grandfather had always been eccentric, a man of peculiar interests, but this was different. He was determined to find a logical explanation for everything. He had to. The island, it seemed, was beginning to sing. The journal felt ancient in Dean's hands, its leather cover a mottled landscape of deep browns and greens, textured like old, sun-baked kelp. A faint, briny scent, almost like a forgotten tide pool, clung to its pages. He ran a thumb over the raised, almost organic patterns that had formed on the warped hide, a shiver tracing his spine. It was bound with thick waxed string, knotted tight, as if whatever lay within was desperate to remain hidden. He untied the knot, the string stiff and resistant, and the journal fell open with a soft, dry rustle. The pages, thick and yellowed, were filled with a spidery, precise script. His grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible. Dean began to read, his eyes scanning the earliest entries, which dated back decades. Initially, they were mundane, observations about the weather, lighthouse maintenance, supply runs. But gradually, a darker thread began to weave through the daily logs. References to the whispers from the deep, the strange currents, and the unsettling dreams. His grandfather's tone shifted from detached observation to a growing obsession. A sunken city? He'd dismissed such things as fanciful local folklore, but his grandfather's meticulous hand didn't lend itself to outright delusion. Later entries grew more frantic, describing a pact made long ago, a tribute demanded by something vast and ancient. The words blurred into a horrifying tapestry of dread, hinting at rites performed under a moonless sky, at sacrifices whispered into the roaring wind. The revelations unsettled Dean profoundly. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was reading a confession, a slow descent into a terrifying truth. He needed answers beyond these cryptic scrawls. The island, for all its isolation, must have some history, some records. The next morning, driven by a gnawing unease, Dean decided to visit the mainland. He needed to search the regional archives to find anything that might corroborate or debunk his grandfather's unsettling claims. Upon reaching the mainland, he had to pass through the small, weather-beaten border checkpoint that monitored passage to and from the remote island. A lone officer, his face ruddy and expressionless, peered at Dean's identification. The air was thick with the smell of brine and damp wool. The officer's eyes, a startling pale blue, seemed to linger on Dean a moment too long, a silent question in their depths before waving him through with a curt nod. He spent the rest of the day in a dusty, forgotten corner of the public library, poring over brittle microfiche and ancient, leather-bound tomes detailing the region's history. Scattered mentions in obscure historical accounts, old maritime logs, and collections of local legends all echoed themes from his grandfather's journal. He was no longer dismissing his grandfather's writings as the ramblings of an old man. That night, the dreams began. He found himself submerged in an infinite blackness, the pressure of the deep pressing in on him from all sides, yet he could still breathe. Strange, phosphorescent currents pulsed around him, revealing fleeting, impossible shapes in the periphery of his vision. Colossal, indistinct forms that moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, needing to ground himself. As his bare feet touched the cool floorboards, he noticed a faint, ethereal glow emanating from the corner of the room, near the old stone fireplace. He approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. There, clinging to the damp stone, was a patch of algae unlike anything he had ever seen. It pulsed with a soft green-blue light, a network of intricate, glowing filaments. It looked like something that belonged on the ocean floor, not in his grandfather's cottage. It was damp, almost gelatinous. The air around it felt strangely heavy, charged. The algae wasn't just in the corner. He saw another small patch near the baseboard by the window, and a faint smear on the edge of the hearth. The ocean, it seemed, was not content to remain outside. It was seeping in, bringing with it the secrets and horrors of its deepest reaches. The salt-crusted pages of his grandfather's journal lay open on the warped kitchen table, the lamp casting a sickly yellow glow on the frantic script. Dean traced the words with a trembling finger. Pact, tribute, vast. He'd dismissed such things as the ramblings of a man succumbing to isolation, but the precise, almost scientific hand that had drawn the island's contours didn't lend itself to outright delusion. His stomach churned with a cold, metallic dread that tasted of the sea. A low hum began, a resonant thrum that vibrated not just in the air, but in the very bones of the cottage. It was too deep to be the wind, too steady to be the creaking timbers. It felt ancient, an echo from the abyssal trenches, rising. Dean pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound persisted, a pressure behind his eyes, a dull ache in his jaw. The walls, the very air itself seemed to sing with it. He pushed the journal away, the sensation of the hum making him restless. He walked into the small parlor, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, dust-laden objects. As he passed the mantelpiece, a small, chipped porcelain figurine of a seabird, one his grandmother had cherished, slid an inch across the polished wood, then stopped. Dean froze. He stared at it, then at the mantel, then back at the figurine. He could have sworn it moved. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool ceramic. He must have bumped the table, or the old house was settling. He tried to rationalize, but the hum in his head seemed to mock his attempts at logic. The next morning, the hum was still there, a constant low throb beneath the waves of his consciousness. He found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the ceaseless churn of the gray ocean. His reflection shimmered back at him, superimposed on the roiling sea. For a fleeting, horrifying instant, his eyes in the glass seemed too wide, too black, the skin around them stretched and glistening as if wet. His own face, but not his own. A stranger's face, an inhabitant of the deep. He blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his tired, pale features staring back. He decided to walk. He needed distance from the cottage, from the journal, from the insidious hum. He followed a barely discernible path along the rugged coastline, the wind tearing at his clothes. He remembered his grandfather mentioning an old border checkpoint, a relic from an attempt decades ago to regulate access to the island, an attempt that had long since been abandoned. He'd never paid it much mind, assuming it was just a local's quaint name for a dilapidated shack. The structure emerged from the fog, more substantial than he'd imagined, though still crumbling. It was a squat, concrete blockhouse, overgrown with tenacious ivy and seagrass, its windowless facade like a blind eye watching the churning expanse. The heavy, rusted iron gate that once barred the path lay half buried in the sand, a skeletal grin. The interior was mostly empty, save for a few rusted metal lockers and a desk overturned in a corner. But etched into the concrete wall, near where a counter might have been, Dean saw them. Crude, angular symbols, deeply scored into the hard surface. They weren't graffiti. They were deliberate, repeated, forming an unsettling pattern. He recognized some of them from the later, more frantic entries in his grandfather's journal, symbols that his grandfather had drawn alongside desperate prayers and warnings. They looked like anchors, but with too many hooks, too many barbs, twisting into something predatory. Beneath the symbols, a small, shallow indentation in the concrete. This wasn't just a ward. It felt like an offering. He stumbled back out into the open air, gasping, the hum in his head now a roar. The symbols, the basin, the smell. It clicked into place with the pact and tribute. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to understand. He'd been trying to appease. Back in the cottage, the air felt heavy, viscous. The hum was a physical presence, vibrating in his chest. He splashed water on his face from the kitchen sink, trying to clear his head. As he looked down into the ceramic basin, the water, usually clear, seemed to swirl with an oily black current, reflecting the overhead light in a strange, distorted way. And then, from the depths of his reflection, a shape began to coalesce. It was formless, yet undeniably there. He stared, his mind scrambling for an explanation. It had been watching him, reaching for him, a hungry phantom from the depths, now fully awakened. The cottage, the island, his very sanity. All were becoming its domain. The flickering lamplight made the shadows dance, mimicking the frantic energy of his grandfather's script. Dean hunched over the journal, his finger no longer merely tracing, but pressing down, as if to force the meaning from the yellowed pages. The pact must be renewed. The tribute, a constant offering, lest the vast one stir fully. He read the passage again, the ink bleeding slightly at the edges, as if the words themselves were trying to escape their confines. Pact, tribute, vast one. His cartographer's mind, accustomed to the precise lines of latitude and longitude, struggled to reconcile these ancient, abstract concepts with the stark reality of the island. He remembered the last sliver of civilization he'd passed through, a remote border checkpoint on the mainland, a final concrete barrier before the ferry had carried him across the churning water to this place. He'd felt a subtle shift even then, a loosening of the familiar world's grip. Now, that feeling was a chasm opening beneath his feet. His grandfather hadn't just observed this entity, he'd engaged with it. The journal detailed a ritual, a complex sequence of actions, tides, and offerings meant to keep the vast one dormant, a fragile lullaby against an awakening leviathan. His grandfather, the reclusive old man who'd sent cryptic letters about the weather, had been a custodian of something unspeakable. It wasn't the wind nor the waves. It was deep, sonorous, and insidious. The deep song. It had been there before, a subtle hum at the edge of his hearing, but now it amplified, an invasive chord striking deep within his inner ear. The lamplight seemed to waver, not from a draft, but as if the air itself thickened, distorting the flame. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to dislodge the feeling, the sound. When he opened them, the kitchen walls seemed to undulate, the patterns in the peeling wallpaper twisting into grotesque, fleeting faces. He blinked, hard. The faces vanished, replaced by the familiar stains and cracks. A trick of the light, he told himself, a byproduct of exhaustion and a heightened imagination. But the thrumming persisted, a relentless pressure behind his eyes. The journal continued, its narrative shifting from observation to instruction, a desperate plea for continuity. The chamber beneath the light. There, the heart of the warding. There, the final offering. The chamber beneath the light. Dean's gaze drifted to the sturdy, bolted trapdoor in the corner of the kitchen, usually obscured by a stack of old fishing nets. He'd assumed it led to a simple root cellar, a storage space. Now the words painted it as something far more significant, a sacred or profane space. His hands, still trembling, reached for the journal again, flipping through the later entries. The script grew more agitated, the lines slanting wildly. It calls, it hungers, the light weakens, the tide is turning. His grandfather had described his own mind blurring, the lines between waking and dreaming dissolving under the entity's influence. Was that what was happening to him? Was the deep song already twisting his perceptions, making the mundane monstrous? He could almost taste the brine on his tongue, a taste that was too rich, too mineral. He stumbled towards the trapdoor, his movements stiff, as if wading through unseen currents. The old fishing nets offered little resistance, falling away with a soft thud. The iron bolts, rusted and stiff, groaned under his efforts. But Dean's determination was absolute. He could almost make out words, fragmented and alien, promising profound knowledge or utter annihilation. With a final, grating shriek of metal, the bolts gave way. A rough-hewn stone staircase spiraled downwards, disappearing into the depths. This wasn't a cellar. This was a crypt, a hidden chamber. The air vibrated with a palpable energy, a dense, humming presence that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. His grandfather had been here. He had performed the rituals. Dean had inherited more than just a cottage. He had inherited a legacy, a burden, and a terrifying invitation. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of brine and something else. Something metallic and ancient, like rust blooming on forgotten iron, but deeper, more organic. Dean felt the edge of a new understanding pressing in, a horrifying clarity that pierced through the fog of his grief and solitude. They were a map, a desperate plea, leading him to this moment. He was no longer just a cartographer mapping the physical world. He was charting the disintegration of his own mind, guided by a legacy of terror. Determination, sharp and cold as a chisel, settled in his gut. The previous days had been a blur of frantic searching, following the faint clues in the logbook, the subtle discrepancies in the cottage's structure. He'd found it, finally, behind a false wall in the lighthouse's deepest foundation level, concealed by masonry that had crumbled just enough to reveal a hairline crack. The passage was narrow, plunging downward into the earth beneath the lighthouse. He held his lantern high, its beam struggling against the encroaching gloom. The descent was steep, winding, a spiral into the unknown. He pressed a hand against the clammy wall, feeling the rough-hewn stone, the vibrations of the sea a distant thrumming that seemed to echo in his bones. This wasn't merely a cellar. It was a deliberate concealment, a place meant to be forgotten, perhaps never found. In the center, a single rough-hewn stone slab lay flat on the floor, etched with symbols Dean didn't recognize. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision. This was it, the threshold. This slab wasn't just a marker, it was a defined boundary. Crossing it meant leaving behind the known world, however fractured it had become, and stepping into something else entirely. He hesitated, his hand trembling slightly, then pushed past his fear. The air shifted, growing heavy, almost viscous. It tasted of ozone and something akin to stagnant pond water, yet with an underlying sweetness that made his stomach churn. The chamber wasn't empty. Directly opposite where he stood, embedded in the furthest wall, was not an artifact, but an aperture. It wasn't a door, or a window, or even a cave mouth. It seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a silent rhythm. It was a wound in reality, a tear in the fabric of the world, staring back at him like a cyclopean eye. This wasn't just old, it was ancient. It predated stone and sea, a primal scar. This was the entity's true nature, not merely a creature of the deep, but a breach, a gateway. The light from his lantern flickered wildly, then dimmed, as if struggling against an opposing force. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, insidious unwinding. The chamber around him dissolved. Above him, the surface shimmered, distorted, revealing the lighthouse, then the entire island, shrinking, twisting. He saw the cottages, the rocky shores, the familiar paths, all slowly being submerged, not by rising tides, but by a malevolent, inky blackness that oozed from below. The island's vibrant greens and grays were consumed, replaced by a monochrome despair. He was not drowning. He was being absorbed, his identity erased, his essence folded into something monstrous and eternal. They were all becoming part of it. The island a mere stepping stone, a point of entry for something truly vast and hungry. The deep song wasn't just a lure. It was the entity's method of assimilation, softening the mind, preparing the vessel for its ultimate purpose. He felt his own sanity fraying at the edges, threads snapping under the strain. This wasn't just a threat to his life. It was a threat to his very existence, to the concept of self. It wasn't about destruction. It was about absorption, a slow, methodical erasure. He crashed against the rough stone wall, the impact jarring his teeth. His lantern, forgotten, lay on the floor, its beam weak and wavering. His hands were shaking violently, his knees weak. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the horrific images, but they were seared into his mind, an indelible brand. He had found his answers, and they were infinitely worse than any nightmare he could have conjured. And Dean, standing on the wrong side of that terrifying border checkpoint, was already caught in its insidious grasp. The air, thick with brine and that metallic ancient scent, pressed in on Dean. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was a presence, a weight against his skin, a hum beneath the floorboards. The clarity he'd felt moments ago twisted into something sharp and agonizing. The entity wasn't just out there. It was here, reaching for him, not with physical hands, but with an insidious tendril of pure, frigid despair. The lighthouse beam swept past, carving a momentary tunnel through the dense fog, revealing nothing but the relentless, churning gray. He felt exposed, utterly vulnerable, as if the thin panes of glass were no barrier at all. A low thrum vibrated through the floor, a resonant frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight to his bones. It was a cold, deep current, like a submerged river flowing beneath the island itself, and he felt it coursing through him, an unwanted invasion. It wasn't just his imagination. His fingers tingled, his teeth ached, and a chill seeped into his core that had nothing to do with the damp sea air. This was a violation, a quiet, terrifying assertion of will. It wanted in. It was trying to become him. He needed to fight, to push back, but against what? An unseen force that seeped into the very air he breathed? His gaze fell upon the journal, lying open on the small, scarred table where he'd left it. His grandfather's looping script seemed to pulse faintly in the dim lamplight, a desperate message from the past. He snatched it up, his fingers fumbling with the brittle pages. He had devoured most of the entries already, piecing together the grim history of the island and its forgotten pact. But now he wasn't looking for understanding. He was searching for a weapon, an escape, a way to sever this encroaching connection. His eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, skipping over observations about the weather and shipping lanes, searching for anything that hinted at a solution. The binding weakens. The tide brings it closer. A gateway opening. He muttered, tracing the words with a trembling finger. He flipped pages frantically, the dry paper rustling like dead leaves. He needed something concrete, not just portents. Then, a series of entries, marked with heavier ink, caught his attention. They were more fragmented, almost frantic, detailing rituals, symbols, and warnings. Dean's eyes darted across the page, piecing together a desperate, incomplete plan. The seal must be renewed. Not with salt and iron alone. A deeper anchor needed. A point of convergence. He turned another page. There, amidst a crude diagram of the island with swirling lines pointing towards the deep, was a specific location circled. His breath hitched. It was a place he knew, a forgotten relic on the island's rugged eastern shore. The ruins of the old border checkpoint. He'd seen it on his initial explorations, a crumbling stone hut and a rusted skeletal gate, long since abandoned, where, in a bygone era, visitors and goods had been processed before being allowed further onto the island. Now, the journal described it as a place of vulnerability, a thinning of the veil between worlds, a focal point for the entity's influence. It will cross there first. The barrier thins. A sacrifice at the threshold. A true anchor. The words blurred. This wasn't just about sealing a portal. It was about offering something to it, something powerful enough to satisfy its hunger, or perhaps to repel it. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper of the light. He had been a guardian of a far more ancient, terrifying boundary. Dean read on, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The final entries were almost illegible, scrawled with a desperate hand, hinting at the nature of the anchor. It wasn't gold, or a relic, or a spell. It was something deeply personal, a life, a memory, a connection. The journal didn't explicitly state what, but the tone, the sheer anguish in the slanting script, implied a cost so profound it made Dean's stomach clench. It was a sound that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of reality. A hungry, ancient growl. The cottage shuddered. The entity wasn't just probing, it was pushing. The old border checkpoint, a threshold, a desperate, incomplete ritual. He was trapped, yes, but now he had a direction, however terrifying. He would become part of the thing that now sought to break through. The island shrieked. It wasn't the sound of wind, not precisely, but a cacophony of scraping metal and tearing fabric that vibrated through the very bones of the cottage. Dean stood by the grimy window pane, the glass rattling violently in its frame, watching the maelstrom outside. The fog, usually a soft, ephemeral veil, had become a thick, churning wall of gray, shot through with inexplicable flashes of sickly green light. It pressed against the cottage, a palpable, suffocating weight, like a vast, unseen tongue licking at the stone. Something metallic and rotten, a flavor that clung to the back of his throat and would not be swallowed. He could feel the entity, not as a physical presence, but as a vast, cold intelligence pressing in on his mind, probing, testing, seeking a weakness. Outside, the familiar landscape had begun to warp. He saw it now, even through the churning fog. The gnarled cypress trees, already bent by generations of salt wind, seemed to twist further, their branches contorting into grotesque, skeletal fingers that clawed at the air. He spotted a cluster of barnacles on the cottage's seaward wall, not the usual gray, rough crusts, but a mass of pulsating purple and black, slowly expanding, forming intricate, disturbing patterns that seemed to writhe even as he watched. He turned from the window, his gaze falling back to the grandfather's journal, splayed open on the rough-hewn table. He had been its pact maker, its feeder. The offering wasn't a material object or a ritualistic sacrifice of some beast. It was a tether, a binding. The true cost of sealing the breach, of returning the entity to its slumber, was the keeper himself. To bind the deep, one must surrender their own ties to the surface. His grandfather had delayed the inevitable, bought time, but at what price? His sanity, his connection to the world, his very essence. He had become part of the island, a living sacrifice, slowly consumed. And now, that mantle, that terrible responsibility had fallen to Dean. The fresh start he'd sought was a cruel irony, a trap sprung by inheritance. He wasn't just preparing to enact a counter-ritual. He was preparing for a self-immolation of the spirit. The thought was a crushing weight, the immense personal cost laid bare. He would cease to be Dean, the cartographer, the man who grieved. He would become merely the keeper. Yet a desperate resolve hardened within him. There was no other choice. He couldn't let it consume everything. He couldn't let it reach the mainland, the world beyond this cursed rock. He picked up the heavy, iron-bound journal, its pages thick with dried salt and something that looked suspiciously like ancient bloodstains. The final instructions, though vague and steeped in cryptic metaphor, pointed to a specific location, a convergence point where the entity's influence was strongest, where the sealing could be enacted. He gathered what the journal hinted at: a vial of seawater from the deepest part of the cove, collected on a moonless night, a piece of driftwood shaped like a twisted spine. Each item felt heavy, imbued with an unholy significance. He wrapped them in a square of coarse canvas, tying it with a length of fishing twine. Stepping out of the cottage was like entering another dimension. The wind clawed at him, a physical force that tried to rip the breath from his lungs. The fog was so dense, it felt like swimming through icy cream, visibility reduced to a few feet. Every step was a battle against the elements, against the psychic current that pushed his back toward the cottage, back towards a false sense of safety. He stumbled along the narrow, winding path that led towards the island's easternmost point, guided only by the dim, flickering beam of his lantern and the increasingly violent pull of the entity's presence. The ground beneath his feet was treacherous, slick with the iridescent slime, and he could hear the unsettling skittering of unseen things in the dense undergrowth. Finally, through the swirling gray, a silhouette emerged. It was a crumbling structure, half buried in sand and overgrown with the same pulsating barnacles he'd seen on the cottage. An old, forgotten sentinel, a relic from a time when the island might have had some human-imposed order. This was it, the border checkpoint. Not a place to stop people from entering, he realized, but a boundary, a warning. Beyond this point, the veil between worlds thinned to nothing. He gripped the canvas bundle tighter, his knuckles white. This was the threshold. There was no turning back. The island shrieked. The fog, usually a comforting shroud, now pulsed with an internal, sickly luminescence, like a vast bruised lung. This was it, the final act. He grabbed the heavy, leather-bound journal, his grandfather's, and tucked it inside his oilskin jacket, securing the flap. The pages held the fragmented ritual, the only hope. A coil of thick, knotted rope, carefully prepared with specific ancient marine knots, went over his shoulder. It was the entity's breath, seeping through every crack and crevice. Stepping out was like plunging into a frigid, chaotic ocean. The wind, a physical fist, slammed into him, stealing his breath. Rain lashed down, not in drops, but sheets driven horizontally, stinging his exposed skin. He leaned into it, each step a battle against the gale and the island's own growing tremors. The ground beneath his heavy boots felt unstable, shifting, as if the very rock was groaning under an immense, unseen weight. The lighthouse, a distant cyclopean eye, pulsed erratically through the roiling fog, its beam cutting through the gloom with desperate, failing energy. His path led him past the old, abandoned customs house, a skeletal structure of weather-beaten timber and corroded metal that served as the island's defunct border checkpoint. It stood directly between the main path and the winding ascent to the lighthouse, a final, grim gateway. As he approached, the structure seemed to writhe in the fog, its dilapidated timbers groaning like tortured bones. The fog inside the checkpoint was denser, a living gray that swirled with an unnatural intelligence. He pushed through a hanging, rusted gate, the screech of its hinges momentarily drowning out the storm. Inside, the air tasted of decay and something sweet, cloying, like blooming graveyard lilies. He saw them then, not with his eyes, but with a deeper internal vision. Phantom shapes, indistinct and wavering, pressed against the rotting walls. They were the echoes of those who had passed through this point, perhaps, or those who had been claimed. A wave of profound despair washed over him, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. It was a psychological assault, a whisper of futility. Turn back. There is no hope here. Only oblivion. Dean gritted his teeth, his jaw aching. He clutched the journal, its leather warm beneath his gloved fingers, a tangible link to his grandfather's stubborn resolve. He pushed through the checkpoint, the phantom despair clinging to him like a shroud, but he kept moving. He had come too far, lost too much to falter now. The entity wanted him to break, to surrender. He would not. The path to the lighthouse was now a sheer climb, slick with rain and spray. The air vibrated with a low, guttural hum that seemed to originate from the lighthouse itself, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest. Each step was a defiance. When he finally reached the base of the lighthouse, the true horror of the entity's manifestation slammed into him. The ancient stone tower, usually a beacon of stoic strength, now pulsed with that same sickly luminescence as the fog. The air here was thick, suffocating, a pressure that squeezed his lungs. The stench of that sweet, metallic decay was overwhelming. He entered the lighthouse, the heavy door groaning shut behind him, cutting off the worst of the storm but amplifying the internal cacophony. He ascended, his hand scraping against the rough stone, the hum growing louder, more insistent, twisting his thoughts. Then he saw it, fully. Not a shape, not a form he could categorize, but a presence that filled the lamp room, spilling out of the very light itself. The light from the lamp, instead of illuminating, seemed to be swallowed by it, only to be regurgitated in sickening, unnatural hues. A voice, not of sound, but of pure thought, echoed in his mind, ancient and vast, a chorus of untold suffering and boundless hunger. You approach the threshold, little man. The pact is broken. The way is open. Join us. Dean stumbled back, his mind reeling from the sheer scale of the entity. It was not merely in the room. It was the room. It was the lighthouse. It was the island. He understood now. The pact hadn't just sealed it away. It had contained it. And his grandfather, perhaps unwittingly, had allowed it to stir. The reveal. The entity wasn't just from the deep. It was a fundamental, primordial part of the island itself. A living, cancerous heart that had been suppressed. He fought to clear his mind, to remember the ritual. He pulled the journal from his jacket, its pages fluttering in the disturbed air. The rope, knotted with ancient intent, felt heavy in his hands. The entity recoiled. Or rather, the space it occupied seemed to shudder, to ripple violently. It was a profound psychological attack, designed to shatter his will. Pain lanced through his skull, a white-hot agony that threatened to tear his consciousness apart. Blood trickled from his nose, warm on his lip. He swayed, but held fast to the rope, to the words. It wasn't just about sealing the portal. It was about severing his own connection, about becoming the final living lock. With a desperate surge of strength, he tied the last knot in the rope, chanting the final binding phrase. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore through the fabric of the air, making the very stone of the lighthouse vibrate. It was a sound of immense, ancient agony and boundless rage. The phosphorescent veins on the lighthouse exterior pulsed one last time, then faded, leaving the stone stark and gray. The hum subsided, replaced by the howl of the wind and the relentless crash of waves. Dean stood trembling, the journal fallen from his grasp, the rope slack in his hands. He was alone. He had done it. But the cost was immense. The portal was sealed, but he wondered if he had sealed himself away in the process. The guttural words, torn from his throat, had scraped against the fabric of reality itself. A cacophony of soundless screams had filled his mind. A tearing sensation, not of flesh, but of his very perception. The tendrils of darkness, which had been pressing in, dissolved like smoke, leaving behind a vacuum that felt colder than any ice. The air in the lighthouse, thick with the smell of salt and something ancient, no longer vibrated with unseen power. He was left standing, trembling, the journal clutched in hands that felt alien, disconnected. The silence that followed was not a relief, but a hollow echo. He felt diminished, as if a part of his mind, a sliver of his very essence, had been consumed in the exchange. The entity had recoiled, yes, but not vanished. It had simply retreated, pulling back its tendrils from the immediate vicinity, leaving him to survey the wreckage of his own consciousness. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the familiar lantern room. The storm had broken, leaving behind a gray, weeping sky. He could hear the mournful cries of gulls, the relentless slap of waves against the island's rocky shore. They were the world outside, a world he no longer truly belonged to. He had to leave. The thought was a raw, desperate urge. He stumbled down the spiral stairs, each step a jarring reminder of his exhaustion, his body aching with a weariness that went beyond muscle and bone. The cottage below was a ruin of scattered papers and upturned furniture, a testament to the chaos that had reigned. He grabbed a satchel, stuffing in a few necessities, but the journal, its cover worn smooth, felt like it had fused to his hand. He couldn't abandon it. He couldn't. It was the key, the burden, the truth. The small boat, usually tethered securely, had been tossed about by the storm, but somehow remained intact. Days blurred into a single, extended nightmare of movement. He reached the mainland, a place that felt impossibly loud, impossibly bright. The sheer volume of human voices, the roar of engines, the sharp synthetic smells of the city. It assaulted senses accustomed to the quiet desolation of the island. He kept moving, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, an impulse to put as much distance as possible between himself and that place. He found himself, eventually, at a border checkpoint. The structure was unremarkable, a low, concrete building flanked by 2 lanes of traffic. A uniformed official, his face impassive, gestured him forward. Dean felt a tremor run through him. This was it. The final gate. "Passport, please," the official said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Dean fumbled in his satchel, his fingers stiff, retrieving the small blue booklet. He pushed it across the counter. The official's eyes, a pale, forgettable blue, scanned the document, then flickered up to Dean's face. Dean tried to compose himself, to appear normal, but he knew it was a futile effort. He could feel the fine tremor in his hands, the frantic flutter behind his ribs. He could taste the salt on his tongue, not from the sea, but from the fear that never truly receded. "Purpose of travel?" the official asked, his gaze lingering, not on Dean's eyes, but on something else. Something around him. Dean swallowed, his throat dry. "Relocation," he managed, the word tasting like ash. "Starting over." The official nodded slowly, a slight frown creasing his brow. He didn't question the wildness in Dean's eyes, the gauntness of his cheeks, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the counter. He didn't comment on the faint, briny odor that seemed to cling to Dean, even after days away from the coast. But Dean saw the slight shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on the passport. He saw the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, a fleeting recognition of a man who had seen too much. "Anything to declare?" Dean hesitated. What was there to declare? The constant hum beneath his thoughts? He had passed the checkpoint, yes, but he knew with a terrible clarity that he hadn't truly escaped. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the cost was himself. The future was not freedom, but a silent vigil, haunted by the knowledge that the deep, once awakened, could never truly be put back to sleep.